So my name is Shorsha Dunbar. I'm the creator of the Adventure Games podcast, and I will be speaking to Charles about Broken Sword and his Kickstarter. And the title of our talk is Remastering a Classic Adventure Game for a Modern Audience. So are you ready, Charles?
I am. Now, has anybody here played Broken Sword?
Wow, that's a lot.
Fantastic, good. And for those of you who haven't put your hands up, hopefully by the end of this session, you will at least be intrigued.
Hopefully you can at least add it to your wish list afterwards.
Or add it to your wish list on Steam or whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Charles is the most important person we want to hear from. So if you can hear him, that's probably the best thing. So, Charles, I just wanted to ask you first, how did you, because Broken Sword was released in 1996 originally, how did you get the idea for the game to begin with?
Okay, can I also, ask, who is an adventure fan here? Oh, well, that's wow, that's great. So all of you are adventure fans. So if you don't mind me answering that on the basis, so I started writing games in 1981. They were text adventures, and then worked with Noreen, who's somewhere around, at Activision. She represented Sierra. And those early Sierra games were terrific. And I was one of the founders of Revolution in 1990. We wanted to innovate. And I was very flattered at Adventure X in last November, to hear that there are different types of interface for the adventure. One of which is called Beneath the Steel Sky, which was one of our games, and one of which is called Broken Sword, which is one of our games. So it made me realize that we were very innovative back in those days. I would hope we still are, but certainly, that there is proof of that. And our first game, Euro the Temptress, very much moved from a text base to graphic. You can see that it allowed you to string words together as you gave commands to people. And then a game called Beneath the Steel Sky that we wrote with comic book artist Dave Gibbons, who wrote drew the art for Watchmen. And our publisher at the time, Virgin Interactive, could see that there was huge potential in adventure games, but we needed greater production values. If we were going to compete with Sierra and LucasArts and all the big games, and all the American adventure developers were spending millions and millions, and we were spending 10 or 100,000. We were on a completely different scale. So our objective was to really try and compete with the big American adventure games at that time. And I'd had huge benefit working, as I say, with a comic book artist beforehand. And I loved the idea of working with very talented people who could bring a new dimension to games, because it's still to an extent like it now, but we would understand the interactivity, and I was very keen to work with people who really understood the art, understood music, understood narrative, all of these people that could bring a new dimension. And the actual origins came from our publisher, actually, who had just read a book called Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco. And for those, there are a few people nodding. What it didn't come from was a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which is complete and utter nonsense. And Dan Brown used it for the Da Vinci Code, as if it was historical fact, which I promise you it isn't. And I started investigating the Knights Templar, which at that time, they were very unheard of. So our Broken Sword game very much drove the zeitgeist of the Da Vinci Code, of the Knights Templar at that time. And as I investigated, the history just rolled off. It was absolutely extraordinary. That it was just so interesting, and nobody knew about it. And we wanted the sense that the history was compelling. And we started visiting some of the areas that were important, particularly in Paris and in the southwest of France. And it gave a credibility to the history. And what the task was then was to try and find ways to integrate the story into the puzzle elements. But from a graphic perspective, the real breakthrough for me was traveling to Dublin to a place called Ballyfermot College, which was where animators and layout artists were being trained for the Don Bluth studios. And the Don Bluth had studios in Dublin at that time. And my eyes being opened to the incredible skill of the animators, but particularly the layout artists. And this tutor called Owen Cahill looked at what we were doing, and he said, "This is not good enough." He said, "I'm going to show you what I do." And he showed me the layouts that he'd spent a lifetime absolutely perfecting. Nowadays, everything's in 3D, and that's absolutely fine. But the beauty of what 2D does is it emulates 3D by a camera will travel across a flat plane, and the layout artist will change the perspective as the camera moves. And it gives a completely different feeling to 3D. That's not to say 3D is right or wrong, but it takes a lifetime to master the ability to change the perspective in really, really effectively. And at the end of it, I was blown away. He said, "You need to employ me." And I said, "I really, really do." And I'm delighted that I did. And he very much drove the early ideas visually for Broken Sword. Sorry, this was meant to be a really short question, wasn't it?
Don't worry.
And I've told this story, so forgive anybody who's heard this before. But also, about 5 years earlier, just when I was just beginning, I played cricket. I know very few of you will even know what cricket is, and even fewer will understand why there's any interest in it whatsoever. But it's one of those games. Anyway, the Australians and the Indians love it. And I met a young composer called Barrington Phelan who played cricket with me, and he was enormously keen, much keener than I was. And he then went on, as we started Broken Sword, I'd lost touch with him because I'd moved up to the north of England and he was still in London. And he'd become very, very well known for various television series. And I pulled him in. So the genesis of this, to answer the question, is both the idea of what the history should be, the idea of wanting to enhance our production values, and then pulling together an amazing team of people. And I also want to say that we brought forward an extraordinary internal team as well. That was a team that understood the way that sprites worked, the way that you could do various bits and pieces. So it was really trying to get the best of our wonderful team, internal team, and then people from outside as well.
Thank you for that very good answer. 30 years later, why do you think people still have an interest in the Broken Sword games? Why do you think you're still so interested? Because Broken Sword as a series is still so popular 30 years later. Why do you think that is so? Why do you think people love the whole series so much?
Well, did everyone hear that one? So why is I think I've got a higher pitched voice than you.
Yeah. So what? Go ahead.
Yeah. So Sosha was asking about why Broken Sword is still popular, and obviously that's like asking, praise your own work, which obviously, being the humble person that I am, I would never want to do. So I would try and remove myself and say, if I was sitting outside, we probably all love the adventure games like Monkey Island. The thing about Monkey Island is that the puzzles are slapstick puzzles. The classic, and of course it's easy to go on a classic, but the classic would be that you have to undo a nut. So you need to get a banana, to hypnotize a monkey, to put the monkey in your pocket, it turns into a monkey wrench, and the monkey wrench can then, the point is that all of these things, and also in English, we don't use the term monkey wrench, which was problematic. It made the puzzle that much harder. But also, those games, and generally those games at the time, were brilliantly humorous, but they relied on the gag after you discovered the solution, which inevitably meant that you would try every object and every other object, you try combining, and it was joyful when you got the solution, but there wasn't this sense that if you really looked into the world, or there was much less sense that if you looked into the world, that you'd be able to work out. And what Revolution, and I was trying to do, successfully or not successfully, was make it so that the puzzles were logical within the context of the character motivation. So when you met interesting characters, you would want to find out what their motivations were, because that was going to be the process by which you move forward. Now, I would argue that those puzzles are a lot harder to write, not least because the solution is often very obvious. So you need to find ways, without breaking the logic of the world, without breaking the logic of the characters, working out how you can make it more complex by going deeper rather than by going just simply making the puzzles more, dare I use the word contrived. I don't mean that for Monkey Island, but a lot of games at that time had really contrived puzzles. And that was because that was the way that those designers chose to hide the solution. We chose to go deeper, and it meant that our games took way longer to design, and some people preferred the more slapsticks ones, and some people preferred the games in the more logical way. I'd like to think that, you know, whatever the sensibility of the 1990s was, that in 2024, because people don't want to be frustrated in the way that they would have been, I would hope that games like Broken Sword have survived the test of time and feel, you know, hopefully will appeal to a contemporary audience in the way that they did back in the 90s, I would hope.
Thank you. So you can repeat my question then. Why did you decide to remaster Broken Sword, and why Kickstarter?
Well, we thing about adventure games is they are niche, but they are a sizable niche, and we have the most wonderful community. We have people who are very passionate. We have a little studio, tiny little studio in York, in the north of England, and people come on pilgrimages to be photographed underneath our sign. People just, I was just not long ago, just a couple of weeks ago. You know, I was rather grumpy. I was leaving the office, and I was rather grumpy because it was late, and the clocks hadn't changed. It was dark, and behind me, I heard a young woman with her child and her husband, and she said, "And this, darling, is where Revolution are. And when you get older, we'll play Broken Sword with you." And the point being that she had played with her parents, and now she was going to play with her children. And this passion has endured. And we were lucky. We had a very good publisher in the 90s, Virgin Interactive. Then we did a PlayStation game. We were very lucky to convince Sony to publish it. They had very little interest. The game because they believed that their audience for the original PlayStation was people who wanted visceral 3D games. And then Broken Sword came out. Nobody was interested. The magazines loved it. It went absolutely huge, and we sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies, and were voted the 4th or the 5th best PlayStation game ever. I mean, it completely contradicted the understandings and the expectations of our publishers. And this has kind of happened again and again and again. Publishers have always hated adventure games, right from the very beginning. They think that they're old-fashioned. They think that the audience is an unexciting one. They don't think that they will scale. You can't sell non-fungible tokens through adventures. You can't do all of these things that publishers love doing. And yet we have this wonderful, wonderful hardcore community who are extraordinarily loyal. But my big mission at the moment is that we need to make sure that the game appeals to a younger generation as well. And we clearly want to make sure that anything that we do is loved by our current community, because to turn our back on that and to sort of somehow dismiss that people who are fans of adventures would be insane. But I'm sure there's a way also to appeal to a younger audience as well. And the way I want to do that is to really rethink from the ground up, why do people love adventure games? And what does a younger audience and what does a new audience expect from games that they couldn't get previously? And for anybody who came to my talk yesterday, did anybody come to my talk yesterday? Oh, so plenty of people who didn't. Great. So forgive me for repeating myself, for those who did. I'll only be very brief for those who did. So what we did in considering how to remaster our first Broken Sword in 4K is we got some random testers. It was just an internet service, cloud service, videoed them playing the game for half an hour and watched. Now, our review scores on mobile, on console, on PC are all very, very, not all, but generally they're averaging at about 85% plus. So we knew that the people who were giving us reviews loved the game, and we kind of assumed that that was the way the market worked. We put it out for a fairly small number of testers, and we reviewed it, and we were getting 50% scores. We were getting really low scores, like sometimes lower than that across all the ratings. And people were getting stuck and they were getting frustrated. And these were people who played games. It wasn't like they didn't understand games. It's just they didn't understand how to play a point-and-click adventure, which we had assumed everybody would know. And it was an absolutely terrifying thing to see, because we kind of thought we knew our audience, we knew our audience, we thought we knew what the wider audience would want. But it was also exciting, because what it suggested was that people who were hardcore were playing the game, and that was great. But anybody outside was being alienated because we completely screwed up our approach. And not least that the game, the Broken Sword adventure system, which was written in the mid-90s, for a screen resolution that was at 640/400, so everything was blocky. Like, we hadn't come up to date. We hadn't said, and also had a limitation of 256 colors at any one time. Huge limitations that clearly don't exist today. And what this wake-up call was, Jesus, we really need to think about what we can do, how we can appeal to a new audience. And the punchline, forgive me, I kind of drew it out a little bit yesterday, but the punchline is that by really thinking about how we can stop people being frustrated, or how we can try and stop people being frustrated, how we can make the interface more intuitive, how we can use the fact that we've got now a gazillion colors and we've got high resolution. And when we iterated, we went from like 40% to 80% review scores from this random group. So it made these small changes and a lot of thought and a few changes made a profound difference to the way that this random group of players was giving their feedback, which was enormously exciting, but also frustrating that we hadn't done this years and years ago, which was very naive.
Well, on that point, Charles, the Kickstarter, which was hugely successful, you got 700,000, I think, didn't you?
We got over 600,000.
600,000,
yeah.
So that's fantastic. The Kickstarter backers, are they fans? Do you know if they're fans of the original version of Broken Sword, or are they new fans who want to play the remastered Broken Sword Reforged?
Well, you need some luck, and as I said, we've had various iterations. I mentioned PlayStation. We got another big boost from Apple, and as I say, publishers hate adventure games and really have done since the mid-90s. I like to talk about when our publisher Virgin. I met with the chief executive, a guy called Martin Alper, who told me that the reason that he makes such great decisions on what games to commission is because he'd never played a video game in his life before. And he wasn't even being ironic. He wasn't. He really believed that. And he actually believes that the reason that he was right was because, being based in the Orange County, he was in sync with television and film, and that actually nobody really wanted to play video games. They just wanted to watch television in an interactive way. So the problem was that we were always fighting against this idea of the publishers believing one thing and clearly being out of sync with what people really wanted. And that was because the people who made the decisions didn't actually play video games. That was the problem. But then Apple came, and then we sort of ran into real difficulties because we couldn't get our games, and there was no way of actually getting our games to retail anyway because they needed to go through a publisher. So it kind of mothballed Revolution in about 2005, and that was fine. And then got a call from Apple, a guy called Paul Burford, and he phoned up and he said, "Oh, I've got your number. I'm from Apple." And we were huge Apple fans. He said, "We've got this new device. It's called the iPhone." And we went, "Yes, we've heard of the iPhone." I mean, it had only been out like 6 months. "Yes, we've heard of the iPhone." We couldn't afford one, but yeah, we heard of the iPhone. He said, "I think your games will work really well on our device." And that was such an exciting moment because it was from, I haven't answered your question at all, have I? It was from, like, we are really in trouble. There's just nothing we can do. Revolution is shuttered. We've got this huge, great overdraft. We're paying all this overdraft fees. What are we going to do to, oh my God, this is something. And Apple were absolutely fantastic. And this does answer your question now. And what happened is that they got very excited because the games that were dominating on the iPhone at that time were games like iFart, then a game called Doodle Jump, which had been done by a kid. It was great, but it was just done by a kid. It was like, it was joyfully basic. And they felt very passionately that, while iPhone was while it was actually iTunes then rather than the App Store, but it was while iTunes was very small and they were very, that was fine. But it was growing, and they needed games that reflected well on their system, and they just weren't getting them. So they didn't give us money, but they gave us huge support from a marketing perspective, and it completely changed everything. And then they did something called the 12 Days of Christmas, which doesn't exist anymore. But we were kind of struggling and really wanting to see, and they did a promotion. I think it was just at the beginning of January 2011, and there were 2.5 million downloads in just over a day. And the extraordinary thing is that Apple, the biggest company in the world now, or they were really excited. They were getting, they're sending us messages over the weekend going, "Oh my God, Broken Sword is now within the top 10 most tweeted keywords in the world." And it was an extraordinary relationship between a tiny little company in the north of England and the biggest company in the world, and the fact that the two were working together in a very symbiotic relationship, which they really valued, and for us changed absolutely everything. So I can't even remember what the question was. So I do apologize.
The Kickstarter backers.
Oh, yeah. So basically, we had a number of big boosts, and that was, I know I'm useless. I'm sorry. I'm doing my best. I kind of wander off, don't I? And
it's okay.
and so we've had these boosts, but there's always been a community that have been excited, and it's just incredibly flattering that we have maintained that. So we decided to do a Kickstarter. And everybody said, including Kickstarter, it's not like it used to be. You will get maybe a third or a quarter. It'll be all right, but it's not going to be. And as you can imagine, once we launched it, we were very open. We said, look, we're going to do this Broken Sword. We're going to upscale it anyway, but we want to launch a Kickstarter for a box. And if it's successful, then we will be able to be more ambitious. And the great thing about the Kickstarter, of course, is one, the money is always very useful and was vital to allow us to achieve what we wanted to achieve. But it also galvanizes the community, which is incredibly important. So you have the people that are following you directly get excited, and then they start communicating. And from a Revolution perspective, millions of people have played Broken Sword. And I meet these people all the time. but they are not people who knew that there was a Kickstarter. They're not people that follow the press. They're not people that listen to influencers. So what is great about being able to build this groundswell is that we can then communicate with the people that are really, really hard to communicate with otherwise. And as I said, we've got 3 generations of people now. 2 lots of people have said this at this conference, that they sat on their parents' knees to play Broken Sword, and now they're doing the same thing with their children. And the nicest thing that I've heard is somebody saying, and I can't wait for my children to have my grandchildren sitting on their knee, and we'll have a 4th generation.
Aw.
And could there be anything more flattering, than that? It's amazing. Have I answered your question?
I think so, yeah. Well, also with Broken Sword Reforged, you are enhancing the graphics. How important is graphics, do you feel, for a modern audience to get them to play your game?
So what I love doing is showing the game, the new game, and I did this actually recently with Chris Charler, who's the head of ID at Xbox, and he said, I'm a huge fan of your work, which was great, and he looked at it, and he said, I remember it. And then I pressed the toggle key to show what it looked like in 64480. And it's really quite a shocker because it looks incredibly basic. And there is a charm, except that, people do love, of course, pixel artwork. But pixel artwork is very specific. Every pixel counts. Broken Sword was never that. Broken Sword was high resolution, squashed down. So it never had the charm of pixel art. And, the scary thing would be to do a game like Broken Sword and find that actually people preferred the pixel. But that's not the case, because it wasn't pure pixel art, it was just compressed high resolution art. So what we're able to do now is to redraw it, and so it does make a big difference. The trouble is that now, before the eyes were just, a suggestion of a pixel, now you can see exactly where the eyes look. So the expectation of the audience is quite different. We had 30,000 frames of animation, 30,000 sprites. And I need to give, full credit to our animation guy at the time, a guy called Steve Odes, who was just a guy that we hired. We worked as a clerk in a local, Kalamazoo, I don't even know what they do. And he just had this passion. And this is the way that it worked in the 90s. We just got these guys with passion who had talent and pulled them together. And Steve developed this incredible ability to animate in pixels. Now, obviously, if you then scale them up, even if you use AI, which we've done to a small extent, you scale them up. You look into the character's eyes. You look at their facial expression. You expect so much more. So the answer is, particularly for a modern audience, absolutely yes. But I think for anybody who's played Broken Sword, I'm absolutely confident that you will find this much, much, much more compelling, because it is the same, but just much more beautiful. One of the key things is that, we're not changing. We're saying that anything that happened in the original game is the canon. Nothing changes unless, and I'm very autocratic about this, unless I can justify, I will stand up and I will say, this is the reason that we've changed it. And we are very lucky, because we could have run into this difficulty with modern day cultural sensibility. But the person who wrote it was very progressive, even at that time. So when we went through and we looked for things that we thought would be problematic, there was virtually nothing. I hope we'll prove correct, but we didn't feel the need to make substantial changes. Which is great from my perspective, because obviously what I don't want is to put out something that offends people now because things are different. But that thankfully is not the case. So to answer your question, I'm so sorry.
No.
From a graphic perspective, again, we used AI just to explore the upscaling, but it didn't have the sort of love of a human art, and so broadly, it's been a massive, massive job, because each of the obviously a screen to draw in 640-400 is a lot quicker than in 4K. But it's really worth it, because it makes a substantial difference. And what I was saying yesterday is that for each of the sprites to redraw it in 4K effectively takes somebody the need to, first of all, draw around and then check that the animation, because also the eye is more critical of the animation as well, to draw around the outline and then to color and ink in the same way. And each one takes about an hour to do. So 30,000 times an hour is an awful lot of work. So basically, this is why the game kind of has to succeed from our perspective, because we've thrown everything into it. And I'm really excited. We got the press to come along 2 months ago. And just the reviews, and well, no, the previews have been absolutely fantastic. This is a game that now really fits into a 2024 contemporary audience, in my view, and in the press view as well. And I hope if you guys get to play it, then you'll agree with me.
Thank you very much. There's water there if you need it.
Oh, thank you.
The final question now from me is, do you think that puzzles are still important for a modern audience, or do you think that they want easier games or remove puzzles?
You didn't warn me about this.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so puzzles.
Or gameplay, game design.
What most people say is that they play games primarily for the story. Now, you've got to have a challenge. In my view, you've got walking simulators, which, according to somebody or other yesterday, is a derogatory term. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, well, anyway. By walking simulator, I mean that there's no gameplay, there's no challenge. And the reason that personally I don't like those games is because any film, any story, there should be challenges. The only difference is that you as the player in a video game or interactive narrative, it is you that is driving, you are overcoming that challenge. And that's what adds that extra element of excitement and of success, the feeling of success, and the joy of moving forward. So instead of the joy of watching your protagonist, your hero, move forward and solve problems and overcome jeopardy, you're controlling it directly, which is an incredibly powerful way. And that's why when video game stories work well, they work really well. Now, there are many, many reasons why they don't, and I won't go into it, except I'll give you one very quick example, and that is empathy. The relationship that you build with your character. In a film, you've got all the time in the world. Well, you don't. You've got the first third. You can build the empathy before the inciting incident. In a game, because you're making the player work right from the beginning, they have to have an interest in what the story is. Otherwise, why would they bother? And they also have to have an empathetic relationship. And we have the intro cutscene in which to build it. So that's one of the huge disadvantages that we have. But on the flip side, we have huge advantages as well. And I think it's really important that as game developers, we understand what our strengths and, more important, the weaknesses are. And the example I like to give is, when games are given to great film directors. Spielberg was going to do the opus magnum for EA, and it all came crashing down after $100 million. And the reason it came crashing down is because the skill set of people who write linear stories and the skill set of people who write interactive is actually quite difficult. It's quite different. And I think anybody who thinks they're the same is a fool. And to the extent that Microsoft did it with Peter Jackson,
King Kong.
I mean, just again and again. And these big American companies have spent millions, and it's all gone wrong.
Oh, got a mic now.
We've got a mic. Oh my God! Finally! Thank you so much for putting up with all that shouting. Right.
You want to start again from the beginning?
Yeah, should we start again?
No, well, sorry for that question. But the final question from me then is, what are your thoughts on the future of, well, first of all, Revolution and of adventure games?
Okay, so this is a really exciting moment for Revolution because
Thank you.
I mean, so far everything's looking really good, and of course we have 5 Broken Sword games, and we recently turned down a television deal from a very major British television production company because our agent was absolutely, he said, I really don't like turning down deals, but these guys are not taking this project serious enough. Broken Sword's really important, and you need to hold out for a company that's going to take it very seriously and very, very ambitiously. So, it might all come crumbling down and it might all collapse. Or what might happen is, as we rebuild back up again from a relatively weak base, and the weak base, as I say, is that the venture capitalists and the publishers and everyone's gone, we're not interested in adventure games. But what we're doing is we're building on the base of a strong community, and that community will grow. And I am super excited by the way we can do that. We can keep control of it. We're not beholden to venture capitalists who say you've got to make your money back in 5 years or whatever, or rather what they say is you've got to make 7 times your money back in 5 years. And what we can do is build gently, but at the heart of it is the relationship that we have with our community, because that, and it's a very old-fashioned thing to say, but we write games that people pay money for, and if we succeed, then they'll buy more of our games and we'll do well. And if we fail, then we go out of business. And that's kind of an old-fashioned way of doing things. But it's also much, much more gratifying, because then we hear these wonderful stories from people who talk about how much these games have meant to them and their parents and indeed their children.
Thank you, Charles. I'll put this down to the audience now. If anybody in the audience has a question, now that we have a microphone. So thank you, Charles. Well done on getting through that.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry, does anybody in the audience have questions for Charles?
Oh, well done.
We have about 20 more minutes just to let you know.
Yeah,
Great.
Perfect.
Hi, thank you, Charles. It's been a pleasure. I've been listening to all of your talks. And, it's always
I'm so sorry. You've heard the same thing again and again, haven't you?
No, there's always something new to So I was wondering, on the technical side, since you're remastering the game and redrawing everything, are you going to future-proof it by drawing to 8K, 16K sprites, and then, keeping the game alive for more than 4K decades? Or, are you doing the future-proofing?
So sorry, the question is, to keep it alive, are we going above 4K? And for Broken Sword 5, we did actually go to 4K because we were future-proofing it. I've got a terrible admission to say, we're kind of assuming that 4K is as high as it's going to get, which obviously is not the case. I think the answer to that is we probably should have been, except that it takes so much longer to do it in 4K, and frankly, once you're a 4K, you kind of might as well be at 8K, mightn't you? So, but the answer is no, we haven't. We've been doing it in 4K as a base.
I have 2 questions. One is very short, and that is like, how many frames per second is Broken Sword? Is that 12? Like,
That's a really good question. So, how many frames per second? So, the original was it 12 or 16? 12. So, what we're doing is that's a difficult question that I have to answer completely honestly. Right, the animation is staying at 12 frames a second, but the scrolling and the mouse and everything else is going to whatever speed it can. So instead of the sort of jerky scrolling that you would have expected, now you have super smooth scrolling, but the animation is still at 12 frames a second.
there's another question, which is more important. Will you ever go back to virtual theater and think for more adventures?
Okay, thank you. So the question, our first game was called Lure of the Temptress, and as I briefly mentioned, you can kind of see Now put yourself back in, as a developer, back in the shoes of somebody developing a new adventure game in 1990, when all we had was the Sierra games as reference, and in many ways they were great, but even by that day they were feeling pretty old, out of date, and old-fashioned. And I'd written text adventures. So we came up with a system that, it was actually Tony called it virtual theatre. And it was this idea that you could give commands, as I said, through stringing text together. And it very much felt like a combination of the text adventure and the graphic adventure. And I'm going to go off topic, if you don't mind, for a moment. So I'd written these games and had my own company. And then it had all gone horribly wrong when the industry changed. And I worked for a publisher called US Gold. Does anybody? Oh, here we go. Thank you. A few people remember US Gold. And then Activision before the new Activision. But I always wanted to get back into development. And so we pitched this game, Nearer the Temptress, to Microsoft, who was our publisher. And I had no idea how it was going to be accepted. And somebody this morning was asking about what your great memories are. And one of my great memories is giving this pitch to this room full of business people from around the world. We had Login from Japan. We had Japanese developers. We had Konami there. We had Cinemaware. Do you remember Cinemaware? There you go. A guy called Bob Jacobs. And I gave a demo. And I said, and that's it. And there was silence. And I went, oh dear. And then somebody started clapping, and then everybody started clapping, and then somebody stood up and started clapping, and then everybody stood up and clapped. And it was like, oh my God. And I'm going to tell a story briefly. Just before then, because we had no money, I had a PC 386, which was absolutely state-of-the-art. And you'll have heard this story. I'm really sorry, but I'm going to tell it again, because I love telling it. In fact, some of you will. And so our two guys, programmers, Tony and Dave, were based in Hull, which is in the north-east of England. And our presentation was in London. And they drove the car down, and I made them, because this PC had all of our data, and it was the most valuable thing we had. It had cost £1,000. And we're talking about in 1990. So, and we didn't have £1,000. So it was very important. So they had to put a seatbelt on it. Okay? Or I made them put a seatbelt on them, because I made it clear that PC was more important than, well, maybe not than them, obviously, but maybe. Anyway, so we're super excited. This is our one chance. All of these people, as I say, have come from around the world, and I have the opportunity to show them. And they've tested it. They said, honestly, it's absolutely bulletproof. We've tested it. It's fine. So they arrive, and I've got a little flat, and they come in. We have a glass of wine, then a few more glasses of wine, and then we have some dinner, and it's great. And I wake up in the morning, and I look out of the window, and in those days, car radios were being stolen to order because there was no protection once you got the car radio. And somebody had smashed the window and taken the car radio. And then I realized that we'd forgotten to take the PC off the back seat. And you can imagine what went through my mind at that time. It was, oh my God. And I was sort of fairly blary-eyed at this as well, which was so stupid. It was a really, really, really important meeting. And not only had I drunk too much wine, but I'd left a PC worth £1,000 on the back seat of the car. So I rushed down. There was debris everywhere. The thief had gone everything. But guess what was still on the back seat? Because they didn't think it was of any value. And there you go. And I can promise you that if that thief had gone off with the PC, there would be no revolution. There'd be none of those games. So in celebration of that one fact alone, we should. And can I tell you one more story? You'll have heard this before, but I love this story. So our publisher at the time was called Microsoft, and it was owned by a gentleman called Robert Maxwell. And Robert Maxwell's daughter is called Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell is currently in prison in America for her dealings with Jeffrey Epstein. Anyway, it kind of sums up how seedy the whole thing was. Robert Maxwell then died when he fell off the back of his yacht, or he was pushed, or he was drowned, or whatever. But the yacht was called the Lady Ghislaine, named after his daughter Ghislaine Maxwell. All of this is not really relevant, but it adds a little bit of spice to this story. Anyway, in Founding Revolution, whatever you think about video games these days, the way that women were depicted in video games in the 1980s was absolutely dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. So, Samantha Fox strip poker, that was the way. It was just awful. And so one of the things that we wanted was strong female protagonists, strong female characters, not for any other reason, but it just made better stories, and it was the way the world, a grown-up world, should work, and a grown-up story should be written. So it's ironic that our first game was actually called Lure of the Temptress, which is slightly embarrassing because it kind of has the overture of being over-sexualized, and it does have a semi-naked... Anyway, I don't blame. Responsibility absolutely falls on the head of marketing, a woman called Alison Beasley, who worked at Microsoft at that time. And the reason that it was called that is that she asked me to come up with a name for the game, and I came up with a load of probably pretty bad names. And at the bottom, I put Lure of the Temptress, just because it sounded like a great... In brackets, this is just a joke. Don't ever give marketing people any idea that you don't want them to grasp, because I can tell you it is a catastrophically bad idea. She, of course, phoned me back and said, "We love Lure of the Temptress." And I said, "Alison, that was a joke." She went, "I know you said it was a joke, but that's what it has to be called." I said, "Alison, two problems. One, there's no luring, and two, there's no temptress. We cannot call it Lure of the Temptress." And I promise you this is true. There was a silence, and she said, "Can you put one in?" So we rewrote the whole game to fit around a marketing executive's idea of what the game should be called. But what they did do is they gave us a bit more money so that we could put the luring in and the temptress. And actually, the game then was delayed beyond the point. And had we not done that, then the game would have released just before Robert Maxwell was killed and the whole company collapsed. And that would have been catastrophically bad for us. So, anyway, there's something good. I'm not sure I answered.
Yeah.
One last
Well, I think the question was about virtual theatre, but
Right, sorry about that. One last question. If anyone's-
there, yeah. I think about 4 minutes or 3 minutes.
For the older audience, if the term adventure games, the point of adventure games is maybe a little bit starting to be outdated, or maybe not representing what it actually is, because basically what kind of adventure games do is they tell a story and you do it with puzzles, which is something timeless. Should be something that artists was making in the 90s, or this is all done. So my question is, should point of adventure games have their own bad things, and not just being all the time referenced as throwback, because it's something timeless at the end.
And can I ask, which country do you come from? Slovenia, great. Okay, I 1,000,000% agree with what I think is the basis of your question, which also has a statement, and that is that what you're saying is that point-and-click adventures are timeless. And I would hope that you're right. I think, the 101, the very basic of any game design is simplicity emerges, complexity emerges from simplicity. Whether all the best games are all the cleverest ones have a very simple interface, and the complexity emerges from that. And that's why adventure games should endure, because the interface is so wonderfully simple that anybody can, whether you're experienced or whether you're just a novice, you should be able to pick up an adventure game and you should very quickly learn, because the onboarding, the tutorial is absolutely comprehensive. You generally start with fairly easy puzzles and you bring them in gently into the experience. So I'm not in any way saying that they should change. What I'm saying is that the user journey should change, and that at the heart, it's a fantastic interface that should and will be, I'm sure, enjoyed by a younger generation, but they just expect a different user journey. The game itself, well, Broken Sword, we're reinventing. The game itself is the same. It's just the graphics are now in 4K and the user experience is enhanced, but the game itself is the same. So I take from what you say that you feel very passionately that actually you don't need to change it. Would that be fair? Yeah. And I would agree with you. I think it's a fantastic interface. And we have always had the world against us. And now, as I say, we've got our community with us. And that's the basis from which hopefully we'll be able to go strength to strength. Proud of the interface as it stands. I would like to thank you all so much for putting up with all the shouting, putting up for my rambling. I must apologise to Paul Solskjaer because
okay.
He'd ask one question, I'd go off on a tangent, and I'm so sorry. But hopefully that was of some interest to you, and enjoy the rest of your show. Thank you.